It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our afternoon keynote speaker. I've had the privilege of working alongside Sue Colley over the past few years and more recently supporting her important efforts through Building Blocks for Childcare, where she is the co-founder and chair supporting Ontario's non-for-profit and public childcare expansion. A founder of Action Day Care and former executive director of the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, she has contributed to important and landmark childcare policy studies. Please help me in welcoming Sue.
Thank you, Elise. And congratulations, Gail. We were only working together for the last 2 days, and it was very moving, and I really appreciate your comments, and I'm sure everybody here does as well. So thank you. I'm going to talk. This is a bit of an obscure topic. It was introduced to us last year for the first time by Jan Borovoy, who's sitting with us today, who came to talk to us about pay equity. And it inspired us to sort of get going and think about, surely we can take this a bit further. So I'd like to introduce you right now to the group that's been squirreling ourselves away for the last several months, trying to make some progress on this issue, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, let me introduce you to Carolyn Ferns from the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, Alana Powell from the Association of Early Childhood Educators, Jan Borovoy, who I've already mentioned, from the Equal Pay Coalition. And I don't know whether she's still here, but Jan Miller has been really instrumental. Is she here still? Oh, hi, Jan. Thank you, Jan, for realizing that we need a little bit of support from the Atkinson Foundation. So anyway, having said that, you may wonder why Building Blocks for Childcare, I should have mentioned that Building Blocks for Childcare is also involved in this little group, is involved in this project today. And I have to say that our mandate is to expand non-profit childcare in Ontario. But we have big barriers. And the three are still lack of capital funding, no guaranteed or secure, really, revenues. They're still a bit too insecure. And thirdly, we have this horrible problem of the shortage of staff and the underpayment of staff. And so that's today the focus that I'm here talking to you about. Staff shortages come as no surprise to anyone. We all know that even the province has acknowledged that 8,500, there's a shortage of 8,500 childcare staff in the province. And on top of that, the National Accountability Office of Ontario published a very instrumental report 2 years ago now, saying that no, if you're going to reduce the cost of childcare to $10 a day, you're going to need a lot more spaces and a lot more childcare staff. So that's the context for this discussion today. The province tells us that we have 40,359 full-time RECEs and non-RECEs. And of those, 22,600 are RECEs, 17,759 are non-RECEs, which means we have 56% of RECEs in the province. And do you know what? 2 years ago, we had 58.2%. Now, there's an issue for you. And we won't go there today, but it's another question to ask, is what happened to those? Let me see if I'm going on here. I've done that. I have to say that I think that in terms of this discussion today, I'd like to thank Linda Cortes for giving us a great segue into this topic by saying that what we need is equity wages. Thank you, Linda, and I think that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. We know that the wages are too low, that much too low, in fact, and we have all kinds of evidence for that. I mean, there are provincial workforce strategies across the country. There is a federal workforce strategy, and even the Federal Childcare Act supports higher pay for childcare staff. In fact, they said that it was absolutely essential. Do you all know that we have an act, a federal act called Bill C-35, which is an act respecting early learning and childcare in Canada. It was passed unanimously by all the parties, and it says that we need high quality early learning and childcare, but it also says that including through recruitment and retention of a qualified and well-supported early childhood education workforce, recognizing that working conditions affect the provision of these programs and services. Absolutely critical in terms of recognition. So we have a huge amount of where did she go? We have a huge amount of recognition for the need for early childhood educators and for their support and for higher pay. And the question is, why aren't we getting it? So we're calling this project that we have the Pay Equity Win-Win-Win-Win strategy. It's a 5-win strategy. Because if, in fact, we could win pay equity, then it would be a win for children and equality. It would be a win for all staff in the sector that would be getting considerably more money. It would be a win for all of those operators who have such a hard time juggling the books and making the balance sheet work. And it would be a win for these SSMs, the municipalities, who actually have to meet their targets. And it would be a win for the economy. And we know it would be a win for the economy from a number of experts that have told us. I think you probably have all heard of the very famous economist now, Pierre Fortin. He was mentioned in some presentation this morning where he said that, the most amazing thing about the Quebec childcare system, which has now been in place since 1997, is that it pays for itself. So it's very good for the economy. And there was a Deloitte report just a few years ago in 2016 that made the same point in terms of sales tax and tax revenues. So we're onto a win-win-win strategy with pay equity. And what does that mean? So first of all, I would like to say that what we're talking about with pay equity, as Jan very eloquently told us last year, is that we are actually trying to close the wage gap. That basically, as everybody has talked about here earlier today, I feel like a broken record, that the childcare workers are underpaid and undervalued. And that results in systemic discrimination. Oh, right. Thank you. Thanks. No, one more. Thank you. Systemic discrimination. And the more that women are predominant in a job, the lower the job is paid. So I don't think that this is new to us. I mean, the Pay Equity Act got passed in 1987. We had the Royal Commission on the Status of Women 65 years ago now, where it was recognized that women are discriminated against. And the Supreme Court has said in no uncertain terms that the mischief at which the Act is principally, Right. The mischief at which the Act is principally aimed is the existence of a wage gap that disadvantages women as a result of gendered segregation in employment and the systemic undervaluation of the work typically performed by women. So it's like, why are we still here? Why are we still receiving these low wages? And why have we not actually had pay equity implemented in Ontario? So that's the question that our group has been trying to tackle through the... we recognise, by the way, that, of course, there are a number of legal tools available for, to help workers make sure they don't get discriminated against. They include the Employment Standards Act, which regulates minimum wages, equal pay, salary postings, all kinds of provisions. They include the Labour Relations Act, which governs collective agreements, the terms and conditions, and the ability to grieve. It includes the Pay Equity Act, which we'll talk about in a minute, and it also includes the Human Rights Code and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So given we have all these legal tools at our disposal, you'd think that maybe we'd be a bit further ahead, but doesn't seem we are. I think that I like this saying. The Supreme Court said, leaving wage inequities in place means makes women the economy's ordained shock absorbers. Now, can you imagine? It's sort of like, is that what we are with the shock absorbers of the whole economy? Sorry. I don't know why this will not move. Maybe. Right. I think we'll go here. So the actuality is that in Ontario, and maybe you all remember this from Jan's presentation last year, that in Ontario, all employers with 10 or more employees are obligated to establish and maintain a pay equity plan, which basically means they have to identify the wage gap between a male comparative job and their own low-paid job and come up with a plan for actually making up the difference. That's in a simple way what a pay equity plan is. And as I said, that Section 7 of the Pay Equity Act requires employers to file and maintain these plans. And further, it goes on to talk about how this should be done. So that it's not just that it says, oh, you have to file a pay equity plan and you have to spend masses of money on lawyers and, if you're lucky, you might get there. But it has actually also specified that the proxy method of comparison is the one that in most cases in childcare, not all, because if you're a big organisation with lots of male workers, it won't work, but for the vast majority of centres that are female-dominated, then the proxy method would be the one that would be available to you to be able to file pay equity. And this has been confirmed in March 2021 that the proxy method is still available to childcare, to all women workers. So the simple thing about this regulation is that it basically says that what you do is you look at your childcare centre and you look at the closest municipal childcare centre geographically, and you take the childcare worker in a municipality and you basically compare your jobs in your childcare centre to those jobs in the municipality. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, as Jan will tell you, But that's basically the essence of it, is that you're saying that I'm going to be able to pay my staff the same amount of money as is being paid to workers in the municipal sector. And we can look here at, I've got a couple of examples for you about what a wage gap would look like. So I've taken this example, they're real examples, but obviously they don't apply to absolutely everyone. In Ottawa, you could have a non-profit early childhood educator who got what we call the wage floor in December 2024. The wage floor that was $23.86, it's now $1 more, but then, and you compare that to the childcare teacher in the Ottawa municipality, you'd end up with a wage gap of $9.08 an hour. So that's what your pay equity plan would be about, is how do I close that gap through a pay equity plan? And then, if you were in Wellington, I know we have a few people here from Wellington, and you had a cook in a nonprofit centre that made $22 an hour, and in Wellington County, I believe city cooks make $27.96 an hour, so the wage gap would be $5.96, and that's the wage gap that you would be trying to make up for. Or in Toronto, we could have a non-profit centre that was maybe unionised actually and earning not bad money for childcare, and they're getting $29 an hour at the top of the scale. But the childcare teacher in the municipality is still getting a lot more. They're getting $36.67, and so the wage gap that you'd want to close is still $7.67. So the question is, why don't we already have pay equity? I'm sure you could all jump in and answer this question. We do know that we have dabbled with pay equity in the past. In 2023, there was a pay equity settlement after a court challenge, and the province did pay out monies to many female-dominated organisations, including childcare centres, which enabled them to catch up to their male comparisons at that time. But it was a finite settlement, and it was a finite group of organisations. And since those years, pay equity really hasn't been on the agenda. There has been no additional public funding for pay equity. And of course, we've been in, as David McDonald talked about this morning, we've been in this situation, or we were in this situation where parent fees were so high and boards were very, very reluctant to raise the wages and have to put the fees onto the parents. So I think the childcare sector got stuck in that period. But now I'd like to say that I believe everything changed on April 21st, 2021, when Chrystia Freeland announced that we were having the new Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. And what that did was put hope in the air. That was the first thing it did. But even more important, what happened was a publicly funded system was born. And that meant that we didn't have to rely on parent fees anymore. And in fact, lots of other provinces and territories have worked on, as you heard this morning as well, raising their wages through wage grids and so on. But even though these weren't necessarily pay equity compliant, nevertheless, they have tried. Ontario introduced a boost to the minimum child care wage through the wage floor, but this did very little to promote recruitment and retention, and ended up with Ontario being the third lowest of all of the for wages in all of the provinces. Okay, so what happened was that we had this, we had this very difficult situation for 3 years where we had a funding formula that was based on your revenues, and you got revenue replacement. And it took the province 3 years to actually come up with a funding formula that would recognise costs. And in the process of that, what the ministry did was to go around and do a survey of all of the costs of childcare centres. And so we got, is that not the right one? All right, thank you. Okay, so the 2023 survey of operators' expenses did not include a projection of gender equitable wages in accordance with regulation Reg 396/93 that I talked about before. So really, this is the big problem, is that we don't have a funding formula that actually takes into account the fact that we should be getting gender equity wages. That's the most significant thing that's happened, I think. And it appears to me that the ministry has overlooked its funding obligation to childcare that enables pay equity compliance and maintenance. And so we're, as I said, calling this initiative, we're calling this initiative the Pay Equity 5 Wins for Childcare, in the hope that what we're going to do is start some kind of campaign that says this is one way to be able to move the situation forward. So our next steps will be to hopefully have some webinars, collaboratively discuss what are the pay equity and human rights obligations for the sector and how this relates to the new funding formula, because I don't think the two can be separate. Really what it is the ministry needs to acknowledge that there is not enough money in the funding formula to cover pay equity compliant wages. Thank you. Sure. Any questions? None. Okay, Carrie.
So we know that at the federal level, the feds have been told, but they're let's say billions, but maybe it's hundreds of millions of dollars behind in their pay equity. That at the federal level, the federal government is hundreds of millions of dollars behind in their pay equity obligations to the to public servants at the federal level. And there have been, I think, I'm doing a guesstimate, like there is, the feds have gone to the trough like 3 times now to try to be relieved of that obligation. The courts have never upheld it.
Right.
Do you see any ability to use that precedent at the federal level in order to be able to perhaps enforce something at the provincial level?
Well, I'm not the legal expert, but there have been a number of provincial rulings that actually would support. Am I right, Jan? She's nodding, yes. There have been a number of provincial rulings as well that have determined that where people have come along and said, we don't need pay equity, could you please ditch it? And the courts have said, no, this is gender discrimination, and you have to abide by this as a result of, in order to maintain human rights, and they have ruled that that has to happen. So it's a similar situation to the feds. I mean, it's always a good question where the money will come from, but it's always a question for me is why is it that women have to take the brunt of the lack of money whilst Ford builds tunnels under the 401, I mean, couldn't we please have some kind of campaign that said, well, we'd have to make it sexy language, but, pay equity versus tunnels, please, or something. Yeah, right. We don't need any more tunnels, absolutely right, but we do need good children. Anybody else have any thoughts? Would you be interested in pursuing this? Yes.
Hi. Forgive me if I missed it, but I think the pay equity you're talking about is with a gender lens. I'm curious if there's been any exploration around pay equity when it comes to similar work for similar values. So I think of, say, midwives and hospital staff. I think of ECEs working alongside a kindergarten teacher when it comes to we're educating and providing learning for the same child. Is there any work or thought on pay equity from that perspective?
Well, my understanding is that most large institutions like hospitals and schools and municipalities and so on already have pay equity plans, which is why the wages are so much higher, right? So if that's what you're asking, I think they already do have pay equity. And so what we're saying with childcare is that we need to be able to catch up to that level of pay and also benefits. I mean, pay equity is also supposed to include benefits as well, which I didn't want to get too complicated, but the benefits should be included as well, and they account for like 20%, so that's a whole other package that could be shared.
Hi.
Rona. Oh.
No, over here. I'm here from BC, so completely different lens, completely different landscape. But we've done some work to develop a wage grid, and in doing so, we worked with our public sector employers council, and we were challenged to set a wage floor, a wage grid that exceeded the lowest level of wages within the public sector, within a unionized environment. So what I'm seeing is it seems to be that you're advocating for the pay equity to meet those public sector collectively agreed upon wages or collective agreement wages. And I'm just wondering if you're getting any pushback from your unionized sector saying these are collectively agreed upon wages. You have to come in lower than that. Is it considered union busting, or how do your unions respond to this?
No, the unions have been working on pay equity all these years since 1987. Now BC does not have, to my knowledge, maybe not just nodding, I think, what we call a proxy method of comparison. So this is why, for us, it makes a lot of sense, because we can actually take the municipal worker and compare our wages to them and get pay equity that way. Whereas in other jurisdictions, the way that pay equity is structured, even though you probably have it in BC, it's different. But it is true that these wage grids that everybody's producing, I mean, Alana says it the best. She just says that there's no process, the unions aren't involved, or even the staff aren't involved. There's hardly any involvement. And so what happens is you just get these wage grids stuck on you. Now, I think the PEI wage grid myself is brilliant, but compared to anything else in the country. But it's very lucky. I don't think that necessarily everybody's is going to end up like that. And I mean, the average full-time wage in Ontario on January the 1st, 2025 was $37.76 an hour. That's the average full-time wage. And we're nowhere near that, right? And ECEs are qualified. They have college recognition. They have serious, responsible jobs, and they're still getting these minute wages. Did you want to say something, Rona?
When you showed the levels for the municipalities, and knowing that, of course, for many of our childcare centers with pay equity, they were our proxy comparators. And so if we're looking at the municipalities, and for instance, you had $33 for Ottawa, and I think that's their starting rate with the municipalities. Are we comfortable in saying that they're confirming they've achieved pay equity within their centers with the very robust job evaluation process as they do?
In the municipalities, you mean?
Right. So is that then the wage that they've come up with? Because I know even with us, if we compare to the municipalities, the challenge that we faced was that we have made pay equity with our proxies in many of our positions. But because the municipalities continued to increase their wages much higher than what childcare had year after year, we didn't keep up.
That's right.
So it's looking at what is the pay equity wage today,
Yeah.
comparing for...
It's how you maintain it. I think Jan wants to say something.
Rona, it's a really good question, or a really important piece of the conversation. So are we comfortable with the wages? What the Pay Equity Act requires here in Ontario for a proxy comparison, which is, keep in mind, an entirely female-dominated workplace where you don't have access to either a male comparator or enough comparators. You have to go borrow one. And the way you go borrow one, the Act set out, as Sue rightly said, Regulation 396, says you go to your municipality, they have to demonstrate, the municipality has to demonstrate that the wage that's being borrowed is pay equity compliant and that pay equity has been maintained. So what's happened over in that municipality or hospital or school board, although I appreciate that school boards are years behind pay equity maintenance, and we could talk about all of the fights that are going on with that, but nonetheless, they are to demonstrate pay equity compliance, meaning that the women who are working in the childcares in the municipality are keeping up to their male comparator job rates. And that's called the job-to-job comparison system, which gets us into the weeds that we decided we wouldn't talk about. One point, if I could, to the folks in BC or across the entire country, is that the robust pay equity acts exist in two places, Ontario and Quebec. Everywhere else, pay equity was introduced in the late 1980s to the public sector alone. Our question as part of our research study will also include, to what extent are those grids, pay equity, human rights compliant? And that means, to what extent in BC did you consider a male comparator, not the public sector female-dominated jobs? Because pay equity is redressing systemic gendered discrimination, which interestingly overlaps particularly in sectors like childcare or nursing homes with racialized discrimination. The two go hand in hand. So that's one of our questions that's part of our research study.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just that I'm appreciating the knowledge and the experience of our experienced, tenured women in the sector, because as I'm getting older, I'm recognizing that the sector is changing and we have a lot of new people in the sector, and I think the voices of our past and the knowledge and the history that we're hearing where pay equity came from and was fought for the sector today. So I just wanted to acknowledge the people in the room that have the experience like yourself that are sharing this so that the young ECEs can carry on the torch as we retire as older women.
Thank you. Well, we'll get the notice about our webinars around, and I know you're all very busy, but this is important, so we hope that you'll take some time to get more information. Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue, for sharing your expertise, your knowledge. It's always a pleasure listening to you speak. Round of applause.